The atmosphere inside the private hospital room was suffocating. The room was cold, but it wasn't the chill in the air that made everyone feel uneasy. No, it was the weight of the situation. Everyone present knew that the world's richest man, a titan in business, was dying. They had tried everything. Countless specialists from across the globe had gathered to save him, but nothing had worked. And then there was her, Lila. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't even someone who would have been invited into a room like this under normal circumstances. But there she was, standing in the corner, trying her hardest to stay out of the way. Her clothes were ordinary. A simple blouse and jeans. Nothing special. She wasn't dressed in a white coat like the others, and she certainly didn't belong among the crowd of people who could have bought and sold entire countries. The richest man in the world, Jonathan Vance, lay in the hospital bed, his body pale and still, hooked up to machines that beeped sporadically, as if even they knew it was futile. His heart rate was erratic. The doctors hovered over him, shaking their heads, exchanging glances. They had no answers. The situation had grown too dire. Lila stood there, feeling out of place. But she wasn't just standing. Her mind was racing, thinking through the possibility of what could be done. She knew she wasn't qualified to make decisions, yet something told her to pay attention. Something told her that she might just know more than anyone else in that room. The tension was unbearable, and then, without warning, Jonathan's heart rate dropped dangerously. The beeping slowed to a haunting rhythm, each sound marking the near death of the man who had once ruled the financial world. His personal physician, Dr. Michaels, stood by the bed, his face grim. The other specialists exchanged helpless glances. There was nothing more they could do. They had tried every procedure, every drug, every possible intervention, but nothing had worked. Jonathan Vance, the man whose name had been on the lips of billionaires and world leaders alike, was slipping away. Lila's chest tightened as she watched. It was clear that everyone around her had accepted the reality, they were going to lose him. But then, something inside her stirred. Without thinking, without even questioning her instincts, Lila moved. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Wait," she called, her voice steady, though her hands shook. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, their gazes skeptical. "What are you doing here?" Dr. Michaels demanded, his voice a mix of surprise and irritation. "You need to leave. This is a private matter." Lila ignored him. She didn't care. "I know what to do," she said, her voice stronger now, her eyes locked onto the monitors. Her words hung in the air, absurd and audacious. For a brief moment, no one responded. Everyone was too stunned to speak. The doctors, the staff, and even the wealthy investors in the room looked at her like she was crazy. After all, what could a woman with no medical experience possibly know? But Lila wasn't backing down. She took a deep breath, moving closer to Jonathan's bed. The monitors beeped erratically, and it seemed like the whole world was holding its breath. Her eyes narrowed, and she began speaking softly to herself, her hands hovering near the machines. Then she reached for the central 4-line connected to Jonathan's veins, pulling it out gently. The room gasped. "What are you doing?" Dr. Michaels shouted, his voice cracking. He rushed forward, but Lila stood her ground. "Trust me," she said quietly, turning to face him. "I know what needs to happen." It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a desire for attention. It was pure instinct. She wasn't just following orders, she was acting on something deep inside her. Something that had been with her for as long as she could remember. For a moment, the room stood frozen in shock. The monitors flashed a warning as Jonathan's body lurched, but Lila didn't flinch. She adjusted the 4-line in a way no one had expected, administering a small, precise dose of something she knew would make a difference. It wasn't a drug, it wasn't a miracle. It was something far simpler. The room was silent as everyone watched, uncertain of what was happening. The seconds stretched, and then, almost imperceptibly, the beeping from the machines began to change. The heart rate monitor sped up just slightly. The color returned to Jonathan's face. It was so subtle that at first, no one realized it. But Lila did. Her heart raced as she looked at the monitors. It was working. Her hands stayed steady as she gently repositioned Jonathan, making the adjustments that seemed to be the only thing that mattered now. "I don't understand," Dr. Michaels muttered. "How did you know?" Lila didn't answer right away. She couldn't. All she knew was that something had clicked inside her, a deep knowing she couldn't explain. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't trained in medicine. But somehow, she had known what had to be done. Minutes passed, and the situation slowly stabilized. Jonathan's pulse was steady now. The breathing tube, which had been a last-ditch effort to save him, was removed. His body was no longer struggling against the machines. For the first time in hours, the doctors began to breathe again. The room seemed to come back to life, but the sense of disbelief remained. "What did you just do?" Dr. Michaels repeated, his voice still filled with awe and confusion. "How did you know?" Lila didn't answer immediately. She simply stood there, watching Jonathan's slow recovery, feeling the relief wash over her. The hardest part was over. But this wasn't the end. She could feel the questions bubbling around her, but there was no way to explain what had just happened. What could she say? That it was all instinct? That it was something she had known deep down, something that had guided her in that critical moment? And yet, she couldn't help but wonder, how had she known? She'd never been trained to save a life like this. Her mind raced back to her past, to the quiet, secret moments of her life that no one had ever asked about. What had led her here, to this very moment? She couldn't answer those questions yet. All she knew was that she had saved him. The silence in the room stretched on. No one spoke, not for a long time. Everyone was processing what had just happened, still too stunned to fully grasp the weight of it. The richest man in the world had just been saved by a woman no one had ever heard of, a woman who had no medical training, no advanced degrees, and no special status. Who was she? How did she do it? The mystery was just beginning. The sterile hospital room was still in shock, but it was the outside world that was beginning to buzz with whispers. No one could quite believe what had just happened. The world's richest man had been saved, and it hadn't been by the highly skilled medical professionals who had been fighting to keep him alive for hours. No, it had been the woman in the corner, the one no one had even noticed at first. Lila stood quietly by the door, watching the team of doctors and specialists move around Jonathan Vance's bed, their faces a mixture of disbelief and confusion. They were all trying to wrap their heads around the same thing: how had she done it? How had someone with no medical training, no advanced knowledge of the latest technologies, managed to make the one move that had saved the life of a man so powerful, so rich, and so untouchable? Dr. Michaels, the personal physician who had been overseeing Jonathan's care, stood by the monitors, his eyes glued to the readings. Jonathan's heart rate was stable now, and his color had returned. He looked alive. But it was more than just that. There was a vitality in his body that hadn't been there before, something that could only be described as a second chance. And somehow, Lila had made it happen. The room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of the machines and the low murmurs of the doctors who were now trying to make sense of the situation. Lila didn't speak. She simply watched. The tension that had filled the room earlier had begun to dissipate, but the questions in the air were still heavy. The answers, however, were not so easily forthcoming. "Who is she?" one of the doctors whispered under his breath. "I don't know," Dr. Michaels replied, shaking his head, still in disbelief. "I've never seen her before. How did she even get in here?" "I don't care how she got in," another voice added. "The fact is, she saved him. We didn't." Lila stood in the corner, still and silent, as the doctors exchanged theories and observations. No one was asking her any questions directly, but she knew it wouldn't be long before someone did. The world's richest man had been saved by someone like her, someone without any credentials, no formal medical training, and yet, she had known exactly what to do. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that she wasn't just a bystander. Lila had known Jonathan Vance for a long time. Not in the way people might think, though. Not as a colleague, not as a member of his inner circle, and certainly not as an admirer. She had known him in a way that only a few could understand. In a way that ran much deeper than business dealings or casual encounters. Lila's life wasn't one of privilege or wealth. She had grown up in a small town, far away from the gleaming towers of corporate empires. Her family had struggled just to make ends meet. But Lila had always been different. Even as a young girl, she had felt a pull to something greater, something beyond the ordinary. Her mother had always said that Lila had a special gift, though she didn't fully understand it herself. When Lila had been just a teenager, she had experienced something that changed her life forever. It had started as a quiet evening in the family's small home. Her mother had been in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and Lila had been reading in her room when the phone rang. It was a call that no one had expected. A distant relative, someone Lila barely knew, had been involved in a severe car accident, and it was likely that they wouldn't survive the night. Lila's mother had been beside herself with grief, but it wasn't the grief that had consumed Lila. It was the feeling of something missing. Her mother had spoken about the accident, the details so raw, so final, but Lila couldn't ignore the strange sensation inside her, the pull that seemed to lead her somewhere else. She had asked her mother to drive her to the hospital where her relative was being treated. Her mother had reluctantly agreed, though she didn't understand why Lila was so determined to go. They arrived at the hospital, and Lila immediately felt it, the same sensation she had felt that evening. The pull. The knowledge that something was wrong. As they walked through the emergency room, Lila had seen a man in a white coat walking quickly down the hall. His expression was grim, and Lila's heart began to race. She didn't know why, but she followed him. Lila watched as the doctor entered a room at the end of the hall. She hesitated, but something deep inside her told her that she needed to go in. She didn't know why. She wasn't trained in medicine. She wasn't a doctor. But something inside her had clicked. She moved toward the room and pushed the door open. To this day, Lila still couldn't explain what happened next. She remembered seeing the machines, the lifeless body of her relative lying on the bed. And she remembered feeling the immense weight of the situation. But it was more than that. She felt an overwhelming urge to take control. There was no time to waste. Her relative's heart had stopped, the doctors had done everything they could, and yet, the family was already being prepared for the worst. Something inside Lila snapped into focus. She couldn't explain it, but she knew what to do. It wasn't medical training, it wasn't something she had learned in a classroom. It was instinct, something that came from deep within her. With trembling hands, she moved toward the bed, adjusting the foredrip, repositioning her relative's body, and doing the unthinkable. She gave them a dose of adrenaline, a precise amount, a gut feeling that turned out to be exactly what was needed. Against all odds, her relative began to breathe again. The doctors, who had walked in moments later, were stunned. They couldn't explain it. Lila hadn't been part of the medical team. She was a teenager with no training, no qualifications, and yet, she had made the one decision that saved a life. It was the beginning of something Lila couldn't fully comprehend. From that day forward, her life had changed. She hadn't gone into medicine, she had no formal education in it. But something inside her had been awakened. A deep sense of knowing, of awareness that would guide her whenever life or death was on the line. And now, years later, Lila was facing the same challenge. Jonathan Vance's life hung in the balance, and she was the one who had stepped forward when everyone else had given up. Her secret, her ability to know what others didn't, was something she had kept hidden for years. She had never spoken about it. She had never told anyone about the moments when she felt that deep, inexplicable pull. It was a gift, but also a curse. It had set her apart from the rest of the world, and it had driven her to make decisions that others couldn't understand. Jonathan Vance's life had been saved, but at what cost? And what would happen next? The questions were just beginning to surface, and Lila knew she wouldn't be able to hide from them for long. The hospital room buzzed with questions that had no answers. Lila felt the weight of those questions, but for the first time since walking into that sterile room, she felt a growing unease. Jonathan Vance's heart had stabilized, but the truth had not. She had saved him, yes. But the world was not ready for what that meant. And neither was she. The doctors and staff had left the room, muttering under their breath, their eyes darting back to her as if expecting an explanation. But Lila didn't owe them any answers. Not yet, at least. As much as she had saved Jonathan's life, she knew there were things that needed to stay hidden. Secrets, dark shadows from her past, things she could never share. Lila stepped away from the bedside, her mind wandering to the years she had spent running, hiding from the very abilities that had saved Jonathan. She had learned long ago that some things, some knowledge, were best left buried deep within. The more she kept it hidden, the more she could maintain some semblance of normalcy. But this? This was different. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The door opened, and a man stepped into the room, his posture stiff and formal. He was dressed in an impeccable suit, the kind that only men with a great deal of money or power wore. The air in the room seemed to shift, and Lila felt a chill run down her spine. This man was no ordinary businessman, he had the look of someone who had seen things, dangerous things. "Miss," he began, his voice low and measured, "I need a word with you." Lila didn't respond immediately. She studied him, taking in every detail of his appearance. His hair was dark, slicked back neatly, and his eyes were sharp, calculating. He wasn't here by accident. She could tell that much. "I'm afraid you're going to have to leave now," she said, her voice steady. "Mr. Vance needs his rest." The man didn't flinch at her response. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. He was like a shadow, quiet, unyielding. "I think you misunderstand, miss," he said, his tone now slightly firmer. "We don't have much time." Lila's pulse quickened. She had been trying to avoid this. She hadn't wanted to be dragged back into the world she had spent so many years running from. But here it was, standing right in front of her, as though it had always been waiting for her return. "I'm not interested in whatever you have to say," she said, trying to stay calm. "I've done what I came here to do." The man paused for a moment, his gaze softening just slightly before he spoke again. "I know what you did. And I know who you are." Lila's heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly what he was referring to, and the fact that he knew made her even more uneasy. "You don't know anything," she snapped, her voice sharp. But even as she said it, doubt crept into her mind. "You'd be surprised," he replied coolly. "I know more than you think. And I'm here because you've just made a very big mistake." Lila clenched her fists at her sides, but she refused to show fear. It wasn't that she was afraid of him, at least, not exactly. It was the memories he stirred up. Memories of a time she had buried so deep inside her that it almost felt like they belonged to someone else. The man was silent for a long moment, as if giving her time to process his words. Lila wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next, but she knew it was coming. "I'm not here to threaten you, Mississippi. I'm here because you've become part of something much bigger than yourself. And if you don't start making the right choices, there's no telling what could happen." Lila's mind raced. She knew the truth of his words. She had always known that the day would come when she would have to confront her past. But she hadn't expected it to happen like this. "I don't owe you anything," Lila said firmly, forcing herself to stand tall, even though her insides were churning. "I saved Jonathan Vance's life. That's all." The man studied her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "You think saving his life was a random act? You think you just happened to be in the right place at the right time?" Lila froze. He was getting too close to the truth, and she didn't like it. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, though she already knew the answer. "I'm talking about the fact that you've just made yourself a target, Mississippi. You've made it clear that you're involved. And when you're involved with someone like Jonathan Vance, there are no simple solutions. Your life is about to get a lot more complicated." Lila swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had saved Jonathan's life, but in doing so, she had unknowingly become entangled in a world that had always been dangerous, a world she had tried to distance herself from. The man stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't have to trust me, but I'm giving you a warning. Whatever you think you know, it's nothing compared to what you'll learn if you stay here. Jonathan Vance is more than just a businessman. He's part of something much darker. And if you stay in this world, you'll learn just how deep it goes." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. The world she had tried to leave behind was pulling her back in, inch by inch. The decision she had made in that hospital room had consequences, and she wasn't sure she was ready for them. "I don't want any part of this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I did what I had to do. That's it." The man didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, his eyes calculating. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. "Fine," he said finally. "But don't say I didn't warn you." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused. "One more thing. You won't be able to hide from this forever. Sooner or later, you'll have to face the truth of who you are." With that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Lila stood frozen in the room, her body tense. Her mind was spinning. She had saved Jonathan, yes. But now, it seemed like there was no escaping the consequences of that choice. She glanced at Jonathan Vance, still unconscious in the bed. The man who had built empires, conquered industries, and become the wealthiest person in the world, was now a pawn in a game much bigger than anyone could imagine. And somehow, she was right in the middle of it. As she stood there, staring at him, Lila knew that this was just the beginning. There were secrets lurking in Jonathan's world, secrets that could tear everything apart. And now, she was part of that world. Lila had never been one to back down, but even she had to admit, the road ahead was going to be far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. Lila stood by the window of the sterile hospital room, staring out at the city skyline. The bright lights of the city stretched out before her like an endless sea of possibilities, each light a story, each building a secret. But none of it mattered now. Nothing mattered except the sense of unease that gnawed at her gut, the knowledge that things were quickly spiraling out of control. She had saved Jonathan Vance's life, and with that one action, she had set off a chain of events she could not undo. She had never intended for it to be like this. She had always tried to keep her abilities hidden, to live a quiet life away from the complications that came with her gift. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. She couldn't stop thinking about the man in the suit who had visited her earlier. His warning had been clear: once you're involved with Jonathan Vance, there's no going back. He had been right, but Lila wasn't ready to admit that yet. She wasn't ready to face the fact that she had just stepped into a world far darker and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Her phone buzzed on the windowsill, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number. The text was short, direct, and to the point. "Meet me at the address. Don't bring anyone." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the tone immediately. It was the same kind of message she had received in the past, messages from people who knew more about her than they should. People who were part of the world she had tried so hard to avoid. She glanced at Jonathan, still unconscious in the bed, his breath steady, his vitals stable. She couldn't leave now, not with him in this condition. But the message was clear. If she didn't go, whoever had sent it would come to her. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that confrontation either. After a few moments of indecision, she made her choice. She had no idea who was on the other end of the phone, but she knew one thing: there was no escaping the mess she had found herself in. She had to find out what was really going on, and she had to do it alone. Lila grabbed her coat, glanced at Jonathan one last time, and slipped out of the room. The address was located in a part of the city she had never been to. The streets grew quieter as she drove deeper into the heart of the city, away from the bustling downtown area and into a maze of narrow alleys and abandoned buildings. The night had fallen completely now, and the streetlights cast eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, but she couldn't let herself be distracted. She had a mission, and she needed answers. She parked her car a few blocks from the address and walked the rest of the way on foot. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something that felt like danger lurking just around the corner. Her instincts told her to turn back, but she kept going. Her curiosity was stronger than her fear. The building she arrived at was old and unassuming, nestled between two larger, more imposing structures. There were no signs, no indication that anyone lived there. The windows were covered in grime, and the front door was slightly ajar. Lila hesitated for a moment before pushing it open and stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. She could barely make out the figures standing in the shadows. 3 men. One of them stepped forward as she entered, his face partially obscured by a hood, but Lila recognized him immediately. It was the man from earlier, the one who had warned her about the dangers of being involved with Jonathan Vance. "I see you got my message," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Good." Lila didn't speak. She didn't trust this man, not yet. But there was something in his eyes, something that made her feel like he knew more about her than he was letting on. It unsettled her, but she pushed the feeling aside. She had questions, and she needed answers. "You knew," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "You knew what I could do." "How?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for her to sit in a chair in the center of the room. As she did, he moved to a nearby table and picked up a stack of papers. He placed them in front of her, one by one. "This," he said, tapping the first sheet, "is just the beginning. You're not the only one with a gift like yours, Lila. You're part of something much bigger, something that has been going on for a very long time." Lila's breath caught in her throat. This was worse than she had imagined. She had always known her abilities were unique, but to hear this man speak about it so casually sent a chill down her spine. "You're telling me there are others?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. "Yes. But not just anyone. People like you, people who can see the truth, people who can manipulate situations in ways others can't even begin to understand. People who are born with a gift, a calling." Lila's mind raced. She didn't want to believe him, didn't want to accept the possibility that her life, everything she had tried to build for herself, had been based on a lie. But as much as she hated to admit it, she knew there was some truth in his words. The pull she had felt in certain situations, the inexplicable knowledge that had guided her in the past, it all pointed to something more. "What does this have to do with Jonathan Vance?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She knew the answer before he even spoke it. The man smiled grimly. "Everything. Jonathan Vance is not just a businessman. He's been using people like you for years. He's been pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating situations, creating chaos to serve his own agenda. And now you've made the mistake of saving him. Do you know what that means? Lila swallowed hard. She had known that Jonathan Vance wasn't a simple billionaire with a heart of gold, but she hadn't expected him to be involved in something like this. Something that went beyond money, beyond business deals. Something darker. "Why am I here, then?" she asked, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. "What do you want from me?" The man leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "We want you to help us stop him. You're the only one who can." Lila felt a rush of disbelief and confusion. Stop him? How am I supposed to stop someone like Jonathan Vance? "You'll need to get close to him again," the man said quietly. "You'll need to learn everything you can about him, everything he's hiding. We've been tracking him for years, but we've never had someone with your skills. We've been waiting for someone like you." The room fell into a heavy silence. Lila's thoughts swirled as she tried to make sense of everything. She hadn't signed up for this. She hadn't wanted to be part of a conspiracy, part of some shadowy organization. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she had no choice. The world she had stepped into was much bigger than her, much bigger than Jonathan Vance. And if she didn't act, things would spiral out of control. But there was still so much she didn't understand. How did these people know so much about her? How did they know what she was capable of? As if reading her thoughts, the man answered, "We know everything, Lila. We've been watching you for years." Lila's mind raced as she left the dark, dimly lit building, the echo of the man's words still ringing in her ears. "We've been watching you for years." Those words had haunted her ever since they left his lips. She didn't know what disturbed her more, the fact that someone had been tracking her or the truth of what he'd said about Jonathan Vance. She had been running from this world for so long. The world of hidden powers, of people who could manipulate reality, of secret organizations pulling the strings behind the scenes. But now, with Jonathan's life in her hands, she had no choice but to dive back in, whether she was ready or not. As she made her way back to her car, her heart pounded in her chest. The night had grown colder, the chill in the air creeping through her clothes as if trying to pierce her skin and reach deep into her bones. Every step she took felt heavier, as though the weight of her choices was pressing down on her, pushing her deeper into a game she had never intended to play. She didn't know who to trust anymore. The man from the building had claimed to be working against Jonathan, but how could she know if he was telling the truth? After everything that had happened, how could she be sure of anything? The more she thought about it, the more the uncertainty gnawed at her. She slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly as she started the engine. Her phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was a message from an unknown number. This time, there were no cryptic words, no threats. Just one line. "Meet me at the office. We need to talk." Her stomach twisted. The message had come from Jonathan's personal assistant, someone who had always been cordial but distant. She hadn't heard from the assistant since Jonathan's accident, and the sudden request for a meeting was unsettling. Was this just another game? Was she being manipulated, or was this an opportunity to get closer to Jonathan? The thought of stepping deeper into his world filled her with dread, but she had no other choice. She had to know the truth, even if it meant facing things she wasn't ready for. The office was located in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, tall, sleek glass buildings lined with expensive shops and restaurants. It was the heart of the city's business district, and Jonathan Vance's office tower was the crown jewel of it all. Lila had been here once before, years ago, when she was hired as a consultant for a short-term project. She had been there, worked her way through the building, but had never truly entered the world Jonathan inhabited. Not until now. When she stepped off the elevator, the receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Lila uneasy. It was as if the receptionist knew something she didn't. As if she were already part of something bigger than herself. "I'm here to see Mrs. Jacobs," Lila said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course, Mississippi. She's expecting you." The receptionist's smile didn't reach her eyes. Lila nodded, her nerves starting to get the better of her as she walked down the long hallway to Jonathan's personal assistant's office. The entire building smelled of power, wealth, and secrets, a heady mix that left a bitter taste in Lila's mouth. She had no doubt that every person who worked in this tower was somehow linked to the Vance empire. They were all part of the machine, and now she was about to step into the heart of it. Mrs. Jacobs's office was at the end of the hall, the door closed and locked. Lila knocked once, then twice, before the door opened. Mrs. Jacobs stood on the other side, her face carefully neutral but her eyes sharp. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice pleasant but cold. "Thank you for coming." Lila stepped into the office, her heart thudding in her chest. "I didn't expect to hear from you. Is everything okay with Jonathan?" Mrs. Jacobs's expression didn't change. "Jonathan is stable, but that's not why I asked you here." Lila's stomach tightened. "Then why?" "Because we need to discuss your involvement in all of this," Mrs. Jacobs said, closing the door behind Lila. "Jonathan trusts you, Miss Carter. He trusts you more than anyone else right now. And that puts you in a very precarious position." Lila felt a chill wash over her. This wasn't just about Jonathan's recovery. This was about something else, something bigger, something dangerous. "Tell me what's going on," Lila demanded, her voice firm. Mrs. Jacobs took a seat behind her desk, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Jonathan is not the man you think he is. He's not the philanthropist, the businessman, the savior of the world. He's been playing a game for years, and you've just become an unwitting player." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected as much. The more she learned about Jonathan, the more she realized he was hiding something, a dark secret that even money and power couldn't shield. "What do you mean?" she asked, though the answer seemed all too clear. "Jonathan's empire is built on lies, manipulation, and control," Mrs. Jacobs continued. "He's involved in things far beyond the public eye. Things that involve power, politics, and, how shall I put it, illegal activities. You've saved him, yes. But now, you're bound to him, whether you like it or not." Lila swallowed, her throat dry. She had been pulled into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But she couldn't walk away now. Not after everything that had happened. "Why are you telling me this?" Lila asked, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Because you need to understand the consequences of your actions. You've already stepped into a world that is far more dangerous than anything you've faced. You need to be careful. There are people watching you, people who will stop at nothing to get what they want." Lila's pulse quickened. Who were these people? What did they want? "What do they want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Jacobs leaned forward, her face suddenly hard. "They want to use you. You have a power, Miss Carter. A gift that others are desperate to control. And if you stay here, if you keep helping Jonathan, you'll become part of the very thing you've been trying to escape. But if you leave, you risk your life." Lila's mind raced. She had been trying to avoid the truth, trying to believe that she could keep her hands clean. But now, there was no denying it. She was in too deep, and there was no easy way out. "What should I do?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Jacobs stood, her face softening for the first time since Lila arrived. "The only choice you have now is to decide which side you're on." Lila nodded slowly, her mind still reeling. She had no clear path ahead, no clear direction. But one thing was certain, there was no going back. The world she had tried to avoid, the darkness she had buried deep inside herself, was all around her now. And whether she liked it or not, she was part of it. Mrs. Jacobs handed Lila a folder from her desk. This contains everything you need to know. Use it wisely. Lila took the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she held it. She didn't know what was in it, but she knew it was the key to understanding everything. And with that understanding came the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. Lila stood in the middle of the small apartment she had rented, holding the thick folder in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stared down at it, the weight of the information inside too much to bear. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment where everything would change. No more running, no more hiding. The truth had finally caught up with her. She didn't know how long she had been pacing the small room, her thoughts racing 1,000 miles an hour, trying to make sense of everything she had learned. The pages in the folder contained details she could barely comprehend, dark secrets about Jonathan Vance, about the people he surrounded himself with, about the hidden forces controlling everything. But the most chilling part of it all was what they said about her. About her powers. About how her gift wasn't just a random occurrence, but part of a larger plan, a plan that tied her fate to Jonathan's, whether she liked it or not. The message Mrs. Jacobs had left her echoed in her mind: you need to be careful. There are people watching you, people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. The truth was terrifying. The world she had been thrust into was not just one of shadows and manipulation, it was one of survival. It was about who had control, who could see the strings pulling from behind the scenes, and who was expendable. And now, Lila was right in the middle of it. She could feel the eyes on her, even now. Watching her every move. Waiting for her to make her next move. But what was her next move? What could she possibly do with all this knowledge? And why did it have to be her? Why did she have to be the one who got caught in this twisted web of power? The sound of her phone buzzing on the small wooden table broke her thoughts. She walked over and picked it up without hesitation, as if somehow knowing who it was. Jonathan's name flashed across the screen. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she just stared at it. He had been unconscious for days, his condition still fragile. After the crash, after the attempt on his life, it was a miracle that he was still alive. But now, here he was, calling her. The man she had saved, the man whose life had been in her hands, was reaching out to her. But why? Lila answered the call, trying to keep her voice steady. Lila, Jonathan's voice came through the speaker, thick and raspy from disuse. You've been avoiding me. Lila swallowed hard. I haven't been avoiding you, Jonathan. I needed time. Jonathan chuckled softly, but there was something unsettling about the sound, something that made her skin crawl. I understand. You've been through a lot. But now, we need to talk. Lila felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had no idea what he wanted from her. She wasn't even sure she could trust him anymore. What do you want to talk about? She asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. The truth, Jonathan said simply. You've learned about me, Lila. About everything. But there's more you don't know. And I think it's time I tell you the whole story. The whole story. Lila's mind raced. Was this just another manipulation? Another way for Jonathan to control her? Or was this his attempt to get her on his side? I don't need to hear it, Jonathan, she replied. I already know enough. No, he said, his voice suddenly more serious. You don't. You don't understand the danger you're in, Lila. There are forces at play here, and if you don't join me now, you'll be on the wrong side of it all. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The wrong side? What are you talking about? Jonathan sighed, and for the first time, Lila could hear the exhaustion in his voice. You're caught between two worlds, Lila. One you understand, and one you've yet to even comprehend. People want what you have. They want your gift. And they'll do anything to get it. I've kept you alive because I need you. But you're more than just a tool for me, Lila. You're the key. The key. The words echoed in her mind, and she felt her world tilt on its axis. She had been playing a dangerous game all along, not realizing just how deep it went. She had never wanted to be part of this world, never wanted to get involved with someone like Jonathan. But now, it seemed, there was no turning back. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Join me," Jonathan said. "Help me, and together we can change everything. We can control the future. You'll never have to run again, Lila. You'll have the power to shape the world as you see fit." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. It was the same offer he had made all those days ago. But now, it felt different. Now, it felt like the stakes were higher, like everything was on the line. "Join you?" Lila repeated, her voice shaking. "You've been using people, Jonathan. Manipulating them. Why should I trust you now?" Jonathan's silence on the other end of the line was deafening. She could almost hear him weighing his words carefully, considering what to say next. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and steady. "Because you have no choice," he said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. "There's no one else who can do what you can do. And there's no one else who can save you from what's coming. You don't understand how dangerous this world is, Lila. But I do. And I'm offering you a chance to survive." Lila stood in the middle of the apartment, the weight of his words crashing down on her. The truth was unbearable. She had known, on some level, that she was part of something much bigger than herself. But now, it was clear. Jonathan wasn't just a businessman, he was a puppet master, and she was one of his most valuable strings. But what choice did she have? Could she really walk away from this and live a normal life? Or was she already too far gone, too involved in this dark, dangerous world? "You don't have to make a decision right now," Jonathan continued, his voice softening. "But think about it. I'm giving you everything you've ever wanted: power, control, security. A chance to be more than just a pawn in someone else's game." Lila's head spun as the weight of his words settled into her bones. She had been running for so long, trying to live a life that was normal, trying to escape the things she couldn't control. But now, she realized, there was no escaping the truth. The truth that she had been part of something bigger all along. And that truth would either destroy her or make her stronger. "I need time," Lila said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll give you time," Jonathan replied. "But don't take too long. The clock is ticking, Lila. And when it runs out, it's over." The line went dead, and Lila stood there, frozen in place. The weight of the decision she faced pressed down on her like a ton of bricks. Was she ready to step into this world fully? To embrace the darkness and the power that came with it? Or was there still a way out? As she stared at the folder in her hands, the answers she sought seemed more elusive than ever. She had spent so long running from this reality, but now, it was here, waiting for her to make the ultimate choice. Lila took a deep breath and opened the folder one last time. Inside, there was a piece of paper with one line of text written in bold, black ink. "The choice is yours." The truth hit her like a wave, and for the first time in a long time, she knew exactly what she had to do. Concludes the mystery by diving deep into Lila's internal struggle. She is at a crossroads, facing an impossible decision with no easy answer. The story leaves readers with a powerful cliffhanger, forcing them to consider the consequences of power, trust, and survival. The ending sets up a future where Lila's journey is far from over, only now, she must choose which side she will fight for, knowing that every decision will change the course of her life forever. James's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of something in them that made Sarah's heart ache. "I never wanted to drag you into this. You didn't sign up for any of this. You don't get to decide that," Sarah said firmly. "I'm here because I want to be." And I'm not leaving you. For a moment, James just stood there, looking at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Then, he nodded, his expression hardening again. All right. But we can't stay here long. We need to get to my contact. He's the only one who can help us. Who is he? Sarah asked, but James didn't answer. He just turned toward the back of the building and started walking, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Sarah followed him, trying to shake off the unease that settled in her stomach. She had no idea who this contact was, or what kind of help they could expect. But she wasn't going to ask too many questions, not yet. All she wanted was to keep moving, keep putting distance between themselves and the people who were hunting them. James stopped in front of a door at the back of the building. He knocked 3 times, then waited. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes and a weathered face. James, the man said gruffly, his eyes scanning the hallway behind him. You made it. James stepped forward, pulling Sarah with him. We don't have much time. They're looking for me. The man nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Come in. We'll talk inside. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then followed James into the small room.